Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Zombie Train episode 216. This is Ontario infrastructure. I actually have the question ready this time, and it's the first time I'm not going to be reading the whole question, because honestly it's kind of gibberish. But, what the hell was that noise? Oh. I need to unlink this sound clip. Crap. I need to remember to do that beforehand, because that sounds kind of weird. Okay. Anyways, if you want to know everything that's going on in this video, go ahead and watch Under Construction for this week. I know I say that every week, but it's worth the reminder. So, that is that in real time, with no, whatchamacallit, with, like, live commentary. That's what I mean. Live commentary, yes. Okay, anyways. Where is the thing I was looking at a minute ago? Okay. Hold on one moment, please. Wait, what? Alright, whatever. Anyways. I had the time of my... Oh yeah, it's Sunny days. Alright. Sorry, I was looking around for some of the stuff mentioned here. So, this is a question posed by, or it's not a question really, but it's by Stephen Binkley. Honestly, Arizona, Ontario, blah blah blah. He is touting Southern Ontario with steel mills, oil refineries, crude pumps, hydroelectric dam, blah 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 blah. Now, he ends it with, where is it? Oh, you know what? I'm not getting the whole comment. I don't know why you would stay in USA. Well, let me tell you, the USA is a lot bigger than Southern Ontario and can afford itself a lot more resources than a small piece of a province. And if that's to say, I don't know why you stayed in the US. We didn't just stay in the US. We actually did a lot in Canada, as I've talked about before. And Southern Ontario is where we spent most of our time in Canada, because the sort of capital, really, of civilized Canada became the Toronto Raillands after we broke their siege. Now, we did use a lot of the things you're talking about. Now, as I've talked about previously, the refineries were not in any sort of condition. We literally couldn't get our hands on one that would work right off the bat. And the steel mills were something you need a lot of input for, and a lot of manpower to make use of. So we absolutely didn't use those until after the Zombie Train Incorporated came about, though I have talked about that at length as well. See, I feel like you have this idea that we avoided Southern Ontario, when really it was a boon for us, just like many other places. It's got plenty of wide open area, and also it is part of the Great White North, where a lot of people fled. If you wanted, and I've talked about this before, if you want to think about, what everybody's quote-unquote first instinct is when the zombies came, or what it was at least, it was go north. Get in the snow. Once you're in the snow, the zombies will freeze up in the ice, and they weren't wrong. In fact, they were pretty accurate with that. But the problem became that just general human survivability, really, is what I'm trying to say. Because it's tough to survive a Canadian winter. Now, the people that did survive, we ended up finding them as far north as James Bay. James Bay! And there was this little town which was isolated enough that it basically just didn't, it basically didn't attract any sort of attention from the zombies, but it was large enough that they were able to hold themselves off, and they were taking in, I guess you could call them refugees at that point, just people that had fled up north, and this was as far north as people were getting out. James Bay has got a lot of stuff sort of clustered around, and there are some other smaller towns like Fort Albany and, what is that, Saskatchewan. That's got a little airstrip as well. I may point out that using aircraft, as in fixed-wing aircraft, for transport around during World War Z was not really the best idea, but if you could put enough distance between you and the zombies, then it didn't really matter. So they were using that airport, although when time finally came about, there were zombified people in town. They were generally able to quell that fairly easily. The only reason I know about them being so important, I suppose, is because that town there had the particular good luck of having a rail line to it, and that is undoubtedly the farthest north I ever went with the zombie train. This was fairly early on when we were still sort of looking for survivors, and after we had established the Toronto rail lines would be safe, one of the sort of field trips was heading north. Now, it wasn't with the whole train, but it was with most of the train, because we would be going through pretty much uncharted territory. There would not be any, I can't think of words today. Any resupply available unless we really, really needed something. And, yeah, was that before the Zombie Train Inc. or after? It may have been before, because we always used the Enterprise for scouting up north after that. Yeah, so it was... Oh, you know what? I can put it on the timeline fairly easily. So, it was during what I call the Barrington Rail Revival Project, which was the restoration of rail service to Newport, and I've talked about that at length. But then, but prior to that, as, when we were coming back from out west, that's about when this fell in terms of timing. Because we got that done, we started making a little bit more of waves, and that's when sort of the proposal came around to create the Zombie Train Incorporated, and we went back west. But we came back from, shortly after the Battle of Portland, when 3254 had been all, put together and inspected and sort of, it worked. There were some things on that engine that were definitely worse for wear when we finally got it to Portland in the first place. There were some things on the engine that were worse for wear before we even left, which, yeah, that was kind of why we went. So, we get back to... And frankly, at this point, Toronto was probably the largest populous center that we had tapped into. They were very well set up. Worcester had been okay. Had been. Past tense. When we left, we came back to... there were... The walls of Worcester had fallen, It was a... I wouldn't call it a disaster area, but there were not nearly as many people as there had been when we left. Meanwhile, some of the other towns and places around it had sprouted up a little bit, but they were still living under threat. Like, serious threat. Toronto, on the other hand, had, its very large lake connection. It was able to... They were getting power from, like Stephen pointed out, they were getting power from hydroelectric plants, even though that was even though they're... Well, they're not right on top of them, but they're fairly close. And there were a couple of nuclear plants nearby as well. I will talk about those on a future date, because one of them in particular, almost led to some deaths of my crew. It had already. But anyways, we got back to the Toronto rail lines sort of as a pit stop on the way back, because we were avoiding certain areas. And because they were good for just sort of R&R on our trip. It's a long trip to go from the west coast to the east coast. They were our last major stop before heading back into Rhode Island. That would be the next sort of day and a half of travel. Or not day and a half, but day of travel. I wanted to say half day, but it really took longer than that. Depends, but it really took longer than that time. Just because we were being careful. We hadn't gone over the rails in a while, and even though the guys at the Toronto Rail Lines were keeping an eye on them, it was less, what's the word? We had less inspections ourselves, so there was reason to be careful. That's a good way to put it. Anyways, the yeah, so they were doing a lot with this. To bring it back to the question, Southern Ontario stuff. They weren't running steel mills, but they were, sort of doing industrial things as best they could with a limited population. They were going out and back to these, farm field sort of areas. They had set up perimeters and were making food for their people and stuff like that. There was some limited metal work, largely scavenging, like I talked about last episode. And they were doing fairly well for themselves. They made use out of stuff around there a lot more than we did. So it's not to say it did not it didn't go unused, because it did get used. It got used fairly significantly. All right. Anyways, so we got back. You know what? Let me grab the timeline for this, because I don't remember when that was. I have been up there so many times since then, in the dead of winter, including, many trips on the Enterprise. The Enterprise, for those who do not remember, is ZTZ-1, which was a dirigible gifted by the U.S. Navy to me in exchange for starting Zombie Train Incorporated. So let me grab my folder. Where is it? Zombie Train. There is Zombie Train Timeline. This needs to be sort of patched up. It's been a long time since we poked it. It was right. It was in the summer, thankfully enough. Yeah. So it must just be my memories of heading up there time and time again in the snow that has sort of skewed my memory of this trip now. So we stopped in Toronto, and it was, we were sort of informed that, a lot of people ran north, and, and we were short on manpower, so why not, We're going to make a little detour, go all the way up to this tiny town of Moosonee, and along the way, if we find anybody and they're, alive and well, we're going to put them on the train and we're going to bring them back. And that is exactly what we did, and we must have gotten, 4 dozen people out of that trip. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but compared to what we had, it was it was a boon. It was a good amount of people to have, and then that meant that group of people knew the area well, and there were about 5 of them that stayed behind in Toronto. Well, okay, no. 5 of them that stayed behind in Toronto ended up running trips, basically up that line and up all the other lines nearby, just in order to find more survivors, and they did. They were pretty much a constant supply of people from then on, until we got better coverage of the area. So that sort of kicked that off. I don't remember what engine they had for that. I would have to poke through my records. But they, so we brought back about 4 dozen people. 5 of them stayed on to do that. Not stayed on. 5 of them got, I won't say hired, but they decided to do that. And then 2 dozen more of them stayed in Toronto, and the rest of them came back to Rhode Island. Or, subsequently got scattered around, but they stayed on the train. And that was, that's the tip of the iceberg in terms of what I actually did up there, and, what was done in that area. Now, it was it wasn't an area we avoided, for sure. It was a fairly important and prosperous region, so to speak, to put it into those sort of terms. So, I don't know where this uppity tone comes from, man. I've talked about so much that we've gotten elsewhere, but this place is, but Southern Ontario is no exception to those rules. So, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them. Of course, I will put them in the list and get back to them as soon as I can. But I will see you next week. Trainman out.